Welcome back. We are now going to hear a closing statement on behalf of Celotex, made by Mr. Craig Orr, Queen's Counsel. Mr. Orr, I can see you there. Can you see us all right?
I can, Mr. Chairman.
And it sounds to me as though you can hear us and we can hear you. So I think we're all ready to go. So when you're ready, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Istefan and Mr. Akbar. May I start by reiterating on behalf of Celotex its deepest sympathy to the bereaved families, survivors, and everyone affected by the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower. Celotex recognizes and has from the outset recognized the crucial importance of this inquiry in ensuring that no such tragedy occurs again. It has approached the inquiry with candor and transparency. It has self-reported to the inquiry matters learned by its current management in the course of investigations carried out after the Grenfell Tower fire. It has acknowledged shortcomings identified by those investigations in the historic testing and certification of certain of its products, and has taken full and concerted steps to remedy those shortcomings. It has not sought and does not seek in its submissions to the inquiry to deny its shortcomings. However, they must be put in the context of the role played by Celotex in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. That is what I will seek to do in this closing statement. Celotex's position in relation to modules 1 and 2 is set out in detail in the written submission that it has provided to the inquiry. My comments today will be structured as follows. First, I provide an overview of Celotex's position. Second, I address Celotex's investigations following the fire. Third, I highlight a number of key failings by the designers, contractors, and building control body responsible for the design, construction, and inspection of the cladding facade at Grenfell Tower. Fourth, I address the position of Arconic, which manufactured and supplied the Rainabond aluminium composite material used in the cladding system at Grenfell Tower. I will refer to that material as Rainabond PE. That, of course, drove the external fire spread at the tower. Starting then with an overview of Celotex's position. Celotex is a manufacturer of polyisocyanurate insulation known as PIR. Two of its products were used in the refurbishment at Grenfell Tower. RS5000 was supplied through distributors and used as insulation in the cladding system. And TB4000 was, Celotex now understands, purchased from a builder's merchant and used to fill gaps in the window surrounds at Grenfell Tower. PIR is and has been widely used in the construction industry. It is an organic compound which in common with all organic compounds will combust under certain conditions. Its combustibility was clearly highlighted by Celotex in its health and safety data sheet, which was available on Celotex's website and cited in Celotex's product literature, including the RS5000 data sheet on which a number of designers and contractors involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment claim to have relied. The building regulations in force at the time of the refurbishment permitted combustible insulation to be used in high-rise residential buildings. There were additional requirements that had to be met when using combustible insulation in a building over 18 meters, but provided those requirements were met, PIR could be used in such buildings. Now, the design and compliance of the cladding system at Grenfell Tower was the responsibility of specialist designers, contractors, and consultants engaged on the refurbishment. Those included Studio E, the architects, Harley, the specialist cladding contractor, Ryden, the design and build contractor, Exova, the fire engineer, and Max Fordham, the M&E advisors. Each of those construction professionals held themselves out as having the necessary experience and expertise to carry out their respective roles. They each had specific responsibilities in relation to the design and construction of the cladding facade under the terms of their respective contracts. They were responsible for ensuring that the cladding facade complied with building regulations. Celotex was not part of the design or construction team on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. Celotex did not design or construct the cladding system at Grenfell Tower. Its sole role was as the manufacturer of insulation, which was supplied through distributors for the refurbishment. Design of a cladding system requires consideration of the system as a whole and each component of it. As the manufacturer of a single component of the cladding system, Celotex could not reasonably have been expected to input into the design of that system or ensure compliance of the system with building regulations. While Celotex was provided with some information about the proposed cladding system at Grenfell Tower, it was not privy to full details of the design process and had no access to the contractual documents governing the refurbishment or the NBS specification, which governed the selection of products. Celotex had no dealings with the architect or fire engineer, whose input would have been relevant to assessing the cladding system's compliance with building regulations. Celotex was never asked to provide assurance that the cladding system was compliant or to verify compliance of the system, and it did not do so. Now, the building regulation guidance at the time of the refurbishment was contained in Volume 2 of Approved Document B, known as ADB 2. This permitted the use of combustible insulation such as PIR in high-rise buildings. It provided 4 potential routes to compliance for a cladding system in a building over 18 meters. First, the linear route, which required individual components of the cladding system to meet specified standards of fire performance. Second, testing the complete cladding system in accordance with British Standard BS 8414 to demonstrate that the system as a whole met specific performance criteria known as the BR 135 criteria. Third, obtaining a desktop study from a suitably qualified fire specialist to confirm that the cladding system would, if tested, meet the BR 135 criteria. And finally, and fourth, obtaining a holistic fire engineering assessment to confirm that the system met the requirements of the building regulations, taking account of the adequacy of the fire prevention measures in the building as a whole. Under the linear route, insulation in the cladding system had to be of limited combustibility, and the cladding panels had to be classified as Class 0 under British standards or Class B or better under European standards. The term limited combustibility, which applied to the insulation, was specifically defined in ADB 2. That definition required in summary that the insulation be non-combustible or classified as Class A2 or better under the European testing regime. Since PIR has never fallen within the definition of limited combustibility, the linear route to compliance was unavailable if PIR was being used. PIR could only be used in a cladding system on a high-rise building if the system was shown to meet the BR 135 criteria, whether by way of testing or a desktop study, or a holistic fire engineering assessment was undertaken. Industry guidance available at the time of the refurbishment emphasized that PIR was not a material of limited combustibility and therefore could not be used under the linear route to compliance. For example, Technical Guidance Note 18, issued by the Building Control Alliance, stated that thermosetting insulants, which include PIR, did not meet the definition of limited combustibility and should not therefore be accepted as satisfying the requirements of the linear route. The limitations on using PIR were therefore well known and should have been familiar to any designer, contractor, or consultant involved in the design and construction of a cladding system. However, the evidence heard in modules 1 and 2 shows that the construction professionals involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment were unaware of, disregarded, or otherwise failed to follow the requirements of ADB2 when designing and constructing the cladding system. In particular, the construction professionals gave no proper consideration to which, if any, potential route to compliance they were following. They had no regard to the fact that the insulation and cladding panels were combustible. They did not consider what impact that combustibility would have on compliance of the cladding system with building regulations. They failed to appreciate that the linear route to compliance was unavailable because of the Celotex insulation they had selected. They failed to recognize that the Rainabond PE cladding panels they had chosen were so highly combustible that they could not meet the requirements of the building regulations concerning the spread of fire over the external walls. And finally, they undertook no assessment at all of the fire performance of the cladding system as a whole, whether by way of a BS 8414 test or a desktop study or otherwise. These matters, we submit, were not Celotex's responsibility. They represent fundamental failings on the part of the construction professionals who were responsible for the design and construction of the cladding facade. Yet, the construction professionals refused to acknowledge this. They all seek to exculpate themselves by blaming others. Studio E, Harley, and Ryden make two particular points. They say first that ADB2 was unclear, and they seek to blame their compliance failures on its poor drafting. Secondly, they suggest that they were misled by Celotex's product literature into believing that use of RS5000 at Grenfell Tower was compliant with ADB2. These arguments should be rejected. They have been devised after the event by the construction professionals to excuse their failure to have any proper regard to the compliance of the system they designed and constructed. I take each argument in turn. First, ADB2. While some criticism can fairly be made of certain aspects of ADB2, the provisions of ADB2 regarding the use of insulation and cladding panels in a cladding system over 18 meters were sufficiently clear to achieve their objective. The inquiry's experts confirmed that no competent architect, designer, or cladding contractor should have been confused about those provisions. Now, as regards Celotex's product literature, Celotex's position is that there is no reliable evidence that anyone from Studio E, Harley, or Ryden actually read its product literature, let alone relied upon the product literature or was misled by it. Nor is there any reliable evidence that anyone else involved in the refurbishment was misled by Celotex's product literature. The construction professionals cannot credibly argue that their design and construction of a non-compliant cladding facade is explained by reliance on Celotex's product literature. RS5000 was first launched for use in rain screen cladding systems in August 2014, after a cladding system incorporating the product had been successfully tested by the Building Research Establishment to BS 8414 in May 2014. Prior to August 2014, Celotex marketed no products at all for use in buildings above 18 meters. RS5000 was marketed on the basis that a cladding system incorporating the product had been demonstrated to meet the BR135 criteria by way of a BS 8414 Part 2 test. The product literature stated that the fire performance and classification report issued by the BRE for RS5000 only related to the components of the system described in the literature, and that any changes to those components would need to be considered by the building designer. This reflected the requirement in ADB 2 for any cladding system containing combustible insulation to be shown by test or assessment to meet the BR135 criteria. Celotex also produced a rain screen cladding compliance guide, which drew specific attention to first of all, the requirements imposed by ADB 2 on the use of insulation in high-rise buildings, and secondly, the importance of building designers ensuring that any cladding system incorporating RS 5000 met the BR135 criteria. This guide was a key part of the RS 5000 product literature. It was distributed along with other product literature to Celotex's customers, including Harley. Mr. Hyatt, the inquiry's architectural expert, confirmed that warnings given in the guide about the limitations of the fire performance classification obtained by Celotex and the importance of designers checking that the classification covered any end-use application were absolutely clear. No competent construction professional who actually read Celotex's product literature could have thought that RS 5000 met the requirements of the linear route to compliance, or could be used in a different cladding system over 18 meters without verifying that the system as a whole met the BR135 criteria. Some of the RS 5000 product literature referred to RS 5000 being suitable or acceptable for use in buildings above 18 meters in height. Those words obviously needed to be read in the context of each product document as a whole. When so read, two things were or should have been clear to any construction professional. First, that the basis for RS 5000 suitability for use in buildings over 18 meters was the fact that it had been incorporated in a system that had been tested to BS 8414 and shown to meet the BR135 criteria. It followed that the product's suitability for use in any particular rain screen cladding system would need to be verified and assessed against the system in which RS 5000 had been tested. Indeed, when witnesses from Ryden, Harley, and Studio E were taken to the product literature in evidence, they accepted as much. We give the references to that evidence in our written submission. Any competent construction professional intending to rely on the RS 5000 product literature would indeed have read it carefully and in full, and not relied on single words in isolation and out of context. Mr. Hyatt agreed with this. However, it is clear from the evidence of Ryden, Harley, and Studio E witnesses that they either did not read the literature or they did not read it with any care. They cannot therefore credibly claim to have relied on the literature so as to justify their disregard of their own compliance obligations. Ryden, for example, suggests in its closing submissions that Mr. Lawrence, who was Ryden's contracts manager, attempted to satisfy himself that RS 5000 was suitable by reading the RS 5000 datasheet. That is a distortion of the evidence. Mr. Lawrence admitted that he in fact gave the datasheet nothing more than a cursory look, which he acknowledged sounded inappropriate knowing what's happened. Mr. Lawrence also said that he probably did not get beyond the headline banner and the first paragraph on the first page of the datasheet. Ryden argues that Mr. Lawrence's failure to read the rest of the document is excusable because he was not able as a contracts manager to interpret technical information. That in our submission is untenable. The RS 5000 datasheet was only 3.5 pages long. It was and should have been readily understandable to a construction professional in Mr. Lawrence's position. As the design and build contractor, Ryden was itself responsible for the design and construction of the cladding facade and should have ensured that it was capable of discharging that obligation by equipping its senior personnel with the necessary technical expertise. However, Mr. Lawrence and other Ryden personnel assigned to the refurbishment had no meaningful knowledge or understanding of the building regulations or ADB2. Mr. Lawrence was not even aware that ADB2 provided alternative routes to compliance for a cladding system. Indeed, he admitted that no one at Ryden ever checked compliance of the cladding system because it lacked the expertise to do so. The suggestion that Mr. Lawrence or anyone else at Ryden was misled by Celotex's product literature is, Celotex admits, unsustainable. Celotex's product literature also referred to the Class 0 classification of RS 5000. Now, Class 0 is a relevant performance criterion for insulation. For example, it is relevant to the provision of cavity barriers in ceilings and other cavities. However, as any competent construction professional should have known, Class 0 was not the relevant criterion for use of insulation in a cladding system on a high-rise building if following the linear route to compliance. The required insulation in such a system following the linear route needed to be of limited combustibility and not Class 0. The inquiry's experts agreed that competent construction professionals would have understood the distinction between Class 0 and limited combustibility and would have known that insulation was required to be of limited combustibility as opposed to Class 0 when following the linear route. Nevertheless, Mr. Ray Bailey of Harley and Mr. Crawford of Studio E suggested in their evidence that they relied on the reference in the RS 5000 datasheet to the product having Class 0 classification as validating its compliance with the linear route. That evidence is analysed in Celotex's written submission. It was contradicted by the evidence of other Studio E and Harley witnesses and is not reliable. It is clear from the evidence of Mr. Bailey and Mr. Crawford that neither of them understood what limited combustibility actually meant in the context of ADB2. When shown the relevant provisions of ADB2, Mr. Bailey accepted that they made the position clear. He and Mr. Crawford should have known that a Class 0 classification for insulation did not mean that it satisfied the linear route to compliance. Some Celotex product literature referred to RS 5000 having Class 0 performance throughout the entire product. This was in order to make clear that the whole product had been tested and not just the aluminium facer or the foam. This was intended to distinguish RS 5000 from Kingspan's K range, which was believed only to achieve Class 0 when the foil facer or the foam was tested separately and not when tested as a composite product. Celotex accepts in hindsight that the phrase throughout the product was potentially confusing. However, its meaning was reasonably clear. As Mr. Hyatt said, an architect would at the time have understood the phrase as simple assurance that the product meets Class 0 in its entirety. Mr. Ray Bailey and Mr. Crawford, however, suggested that they took this phrase to mean that RS 5000 was a product of limited combustibility. That, we submit, is unrealistic and contrived. Even if they read the phrase at the time, the suggestion that they were misled by that wording into believing that RS 5000 satisfied the linear route to compliance is not credible. The final point to address in relation to Celotex's product literature is the description in the literature of the cladding system tested to BS 8414 in May 2014. In the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, and in view of the focus on the role played by the cladding system in the fire, Celotex suspended the sale of RS 5000 pending further clarity and set about ascertaining the relevant facts surrounding the supply of the Celotex products that were used at Grenfell Tower. This work was directed by Celotex's managing director, Mr. O'Sullivan. He had joined Celotex in May 2016 after the Celotex products used in the refurbishment were supplied. In the course of this work, Celotex's current management learned of certain issues concerning the testing, certification, and marketing of Celotex's products. This has been addressed in previous submissions by Celotex. One of the issues learned by Celotex's current management was the existence of differences between the system actually tested by the BRE in May 2014 and the description of that system in the RS 5000 product literature. Celotex acknowledges that this description was inaccurate. The product literature failed to identify that at certain levels of the test rig, a thinner cladding panel had been used, behind which was installed a 6mm magnesium oxide board. Those components were not mentioned in the test report prepared by the BRE following the May 2014 test or in Celotex's product literature. This issue was not previously known to Celotex's current management. I will explain shortly more about the steps Celotex took in response to this discovery. However, it's important to emphasize that the misdescription of the test system had no impact on and is completely irrelevant to the specification, supply, and use of RS 5000 at Grenfell Tower. That is because it is clear beyond doubt that no construction professional involved in the refurbishment placed any reliance whatsoever on the description of the test system in Celotex's product literature. That includes Ryden, Harley, and Studio E. For example, both Mr. Lawrence of Ryden and Mr. Anketel Jones of Harley confirmed in evidence that they never read the system description and took no steps to compare the system tested by Celotex with the system to be installed at Grenfell Tower. So far as Studio E is concerned, the clear inference to be drawn from Mr. Crawford's evidence is that he also never read the system description and never considered its relevance to the cladding system at Grenfell Tower. Even if the construction professionals had compared the system described in Celotex's product literature with the system proposed for Grenfell Tower, it should have been obvious to them that the differences between the two systems were so great that RS 5000 could not be used at Grenfell Tower without further testing, obtaining a desktop study, or obtaining a holistic fire engineering report. This was confirmed not only by Mr. Hyatt, but also by Mr. Sakala, the inquiry's cladding expert. In other words, the misdescription of the tested system was irrelevant. It had no impact whatsoever on the refurbishment. Nonetheless, Celotex acknowledges that the misdescription should not have occurred and has approached this matter with candor and transparency. Once established, the issue was reported in January 2018 to the inquiry, the Metropolitan Police, Trading Standards, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the BRE. At around the same time, the issue was publicly announced on Celotex's website, and steps were taken to notify customers, contractors known to have used RS 5000, and desktop study providers that had been given copies of the BRE's test reports. Celotex also instructed Linklaters to undertake a review of all relevant documentation and other evidence concerning the testing of RS 5000 and to prepare an objective and impartial account of the facts. The result of that review was set out in a BS 8414 summary paper, which was provided to the inquiry in September 2018 as an appendix to Mr. O'Sullivan's witness statement. That summary paper and other appendices to Mr. O'Sullivan's witness statement contain a full and detailed account of the BS 8414 tests commissioned by Celotex in 2014, as well as the subsequent launch and promotion of RS 5000. Given the inaccuracies in the description of the test system, Celotex was concerned to establish whether that gave rise to any safety issues. It therefore commissioned another BS8414 test, replicating as closely as possible the system described in the product literature, so as to be able to share with the market information about the likely practical effect of differences between the system described and the system in fact tested in May 2014. This further test was carried out in April 2018. It showed that the retested system met the BR135 criteria. In other words, it showed that RS 5000 could safely be used in the system described in the product literature in accordance with the statutory guidance at the time of the refurbishment. The results of this retest were announced in May 2018. The matters which emerged in the course of Celotex's investigations involved inappropriate and unacceptable conduct on the part of a number of its employees. This was of real concern to Celotex's current management. Some of the employees involved, including Mr. Roper, had already left the company. Those who remained were the subject of disciplinary proceedings, including Mr. Hayes, Mr. Berger, and Mr. Evans, all of whom gave evidence in Module 2. They and 3 other employees resigned between December 2017 and March 2018. Celotex has sought to learn from this experience and has implemented improvements in its management and operational procedures to ensure that no such situation occurs again. Among other things, Celotex has recruited new technical and operational management, improved training procedures, implemented changes and improvements to its testing processes, and designed new quality assurance systems with the assistance of a new quality assurance manager. In addition, Celotex has undertaken extensive due diligence to ensure that its products were and are safe. This includes commissioning additional fire safety tests of its insulation products. These tests include the further BS8414 test of RS 5000, which I've already mentioned. They also include BS476 tests to confirm the Class 0 and Class 1 classifications of RS 5000 and TB 4000 respectively. Celotex recognizes the importance of ensuring that product literature is clear, accurate, and unambiguous. These principles underlie the Code for Construction Product Information recently proposed by the Construction Products Association. Celotex endorses those principles. It has reviewed its product literature for its current range of insulation with those principles in mind, and it will review the finalized code once it has been formally launched with the intention of adopting its provisions. Celotex similarly endorses the work of the Industry Safety Steering Group chaired by Dame Judith Hackett, which is focused on improving competency and encouraging culture change in all sections of the construction industry. Mr. Chairman, I turn to my next topic, the wider failings of the construction professionals involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. The Module 1 and 2 evidence has demonstrated the extent of those failings. Each of Studio E, Harley, Ryden, and Exova fell far short of fulfilling the obligations they owed in relation to the design and construction of the cladding facade. RBKC Building Control failed to carry out any adequate assessment of the external facade, and other construction professionals involving CEP, the fabricators of the Rainabond cladding panels, and Max Fordham, the M&E consultants, were also at fault. The failings of these various construction professionals were directly causative of the installation of a non-compliant and unsafe cladding system at Grenfell Tower. However, with the exception of RBKC, none of them has acknowledged their failings or accepted responsibility for their shortcomings, despite overwhelming evidence of their incompetence. Celotex submits that they are clearly responsible for what happened on the night of the 14th of June 2017. For the purposes of this oral statement, I highlight only certain key points. I begin with Studio E, Harley and Ryden. In addition to selecting inappropriate cladding panels and non-compliant insulation for the cladding system, these construction professionals failed in a number of other respects. First, they failed to devise any coherent strategy for cavity barriers. Their failure to make any provision for cavity barriers around the window openings is particularly significant. This meant that there was a disproportionately high probability of an internal fire spreading into the cladding system. This failure was reckless. It was clear from ADB2 and other industry standards with which the cladding system was required to comply that cavity barriers were needed around the windows. However, none were provided, despite Harley having been advised by Mr. Mort of Siderise that the absence of cavity barriers at the head of the windows was a weak link for fire. Secondly, Ryden wrongly arranged for SD Plastering, a dry lining contractor, to fill gaps in the window surrounds at Grenfell Tower with Celotex TB4000 and Kingspan TP10 insulation. This contravened not only ADB2, but also the NBS specification, which required rock wool non-combustible insulation to be used in those gaps. This had important consequences. The configuration of materials in the window surrounds also contributed to the disproportionately high probability of an internal fire spreading into the cladding system. Ryden is primarily responsible for this serious error. Mr. Lawrence personally approved the use of combustible insulation to fill gaps in the window surrounds without giving any consideration to the fire performance of the products used or the requirements of ADB2. He admitted in evidence that SD Plastering was not a design subcontractor and that Ryden was therefore itself responsible for the wrongful selection and use of combustible insulation around the windows. Despite this, Ryden argues that SD Plastering and Studio E are to blame and not Ryden. Celotex agrees that Studio E and SD Plastering may also be at fault. Studio E for failing to clarify in drawings that the insulation in the window surrounds was to be rock wool, and SD Plastering for failing to have any regard for fire safety. However, that does not exculpate Ryden, which remains responsible for this serious error. Thirdly, Harley selected combustible styrofoam and Kingspan insulation as the core of the window infill panels. This was contrary to the requirements of ADB2. Harley did this without giving any consideration at all to the compliance of those products. Its disregard of the fire performance of the window infill panels is reflective of its general approach to fire safety. Fourthly, Studio E, Harley and Ryden all failed to have any regard to the fire safety of the crown. That was an architectural feature at the top of the building comprised solely of tall fins of Rainabond PE without any insulation behind them. These fins were found by the inquiry in its Phase 1 report to have been the primary driver of the extraordinary horizontal fire spread witnessed at Grenfell Tower. That was one of the unique features of the fire and undoubtedly contributed to the extent of the tragedy. None of Studio E, Harley or Ryden, though, gave any adequate consideration to the fire risks posed by their design of the crown. Next, I turned to Exova. Exova was the only fire engineer on the project. It bears heavy responsibility for the fire. It failed to produce any comprehensive fire safety strategy, despite having contractually agreed to do so. It misleadingly stated in successive drafts of its outline fire safety strategy that it considered that the proposed changes will have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread. That advice was given without Mr. Ashton, the author of the outline fire safety strategy, giving any consideration to the proposed overcladding of the building. Whilst that advice was qualified by the further statement that the position would be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue of the report, that statement implied, by use of the word confirmed, that Exova already held a fairly firm view that overcladding the building would give rise to no problem, which would just be confirmed later. Moreover, the promised further report was never produced, despite, that is, Exova remaining engaged by the TMO for the duration of the refurbishment. These errors were compounded by Mr. Ashton's failure to exercise any care in answering questions that were put to him by the design team after Ryden's appointment. On 2 occasions, those questions were of vital importance relating to the insulation in the cladding system and the provision of cavity barriers. The answers Mr. Ashton gave on each occasion were inadequate, ambiguous, or wrong. He admitted in evidence that he did not at the time pay much attention because he was not going to spend hours of work on answering ad hoc questions for which he was not paid. Yet he was not transparent about this and proceeded to answer the questions and provide advice that was careless and inadequate. It does not behove Exova now to say that it is not responsible for that inadequate advice, which amounted to an abdication of its responsibility as the fire engineer on the project. I turn next to building control. RBKC has admitted that its building control department failed to carry out any adequate assessment of the cladding system or the crown, and consequently issued a completion certificate for the refurbishment, which should never have been issued. The full extent of RBKC's failings became apparent from the evidence of Mr. Hoban, the building control officer assigned to the refurbishment. Celotex recognizes the heartfelt emotion which Mr. Hoban showed when answering questions from the inquiry. However, his evidence showed that he was not capable of performing his role to the required standard. He had no prior experience of the overcladding of high-rise residential buildings. He lacked the necessary technical knowledge. He was confused about the routes to compliance and did not understand the meaning of limited combustibility, or that PIR could not be used in a cladding system if following the linear route to compliance. One of Mr. Hoban's central failings was not to obtain a comprehensive cladding package. As a result, he did not have the information needed to assess compliance of the cladding system. He claimed in evidence that he relied on Arconic's BBA certificate to verify compliance of the Rainabond PE panels, but that evidence we submit is unreliable. Mr. Hoban did not mention the BBA certificate in either of his witness statements, and he admitted in evidence that his practice was anyway not to read such certificates in detail because he lacked the training and knowledge to interpret them. As regards insulation, Mr. Hoban claimed to have looked up Celotex insulation on a website after seeing it on site. However, it is unclear, A, what insulation Mr. Hoban saw on site, B, when he saw the insulation, C, what website he may have viewed, and D, what he saw on the website. Mr. Hoban said that he knew that the insulation was Celotex insulation from the company logo he saw. However, two kinds of Celotex insulation were on the Grenfell site, RS5000 and TB4000, which, as I've said, was used by Ryden to fill gaps in the window surrounds. There was no Celotex logo on the facer of RS5000. However, if Mr. Hoban looked up TB4000, whatever he saw could not possibly have justified compliance of the insulation used in the cladding system. Mr. Hoban was also unclear about what website he viewed. He gave conflicting evidence about whether he viewed Celotex's website or the LABC website. In addition, he could not recall what he had seen on the website. Celotex submits that his evidence on this issue is wholly unreliable. The tribunal cannot fairly conclude that Mr. Hoban was misled, whether by something seen on Celotex's website or the LABC website, into believing that the insulation used in the cladding system was compliant. There is a specific issue about whether Mr. Hoban saw the LABC certificate for RS5000 when looking for information about Celotex insulation online. If he did view the LABC certificate, he would have seen one of the later versions of the certificate and not the original version of the LABC certificate issued in August 2014. This follows from the likely timing of his viewing of any website, that is, after delivery of Celotex insulation to the Grenfell site. This matters because the later versions of the LABC certificate gave prominence to the limitations on using RS5000 in high-rise buildings. RS5000 was delivered to the Grenfell site in batches from April 2015 onwards, whereas TB4000 was on site ready for installation from around July to September 2015. Now, documentary evidence provided by the LABC confirms that no RS5000 certificate was available to view on the LABC website from the 6th of November 2014 until the 1st of July 2015, on which date the LABC posted on its website the revised version of the RS5000 certificate. It follows that the only LABC certificate that Mr. Hoban could have viewed online after the delivery of Celotex insulation to the Grenfell site was the revised version. That version set out in extensive detail that the BR135 certification obtained by Celotex for RS5000 applied only to the specific system tested, and that an appropriate classification report or supplementary report had to be obtained to evidence the suitability of the product's use in any proposed makeup. For good measure, the revised certificate also stated that thermosetting insulants such as RS5000 did not meet the limited combustibility requirements of ADB2 and should not therefore be accepted as satisfying the linear route to compliance. It follows that Mr. Hoban could not have relied on the LABC certificate as permitting the use of RS5000 at Grenfell Tower. We agree with the LABC's closing submission on this point. Mr. Hoban admitted in evidence that his failure properly to investigate the suitability of RS5000 was a serious failing on his part. It is clear that he failed also to assess compliance of other aspects of the facade works, including the absence of cavity barriers, the non-compliant window infill panels, and the crown. There can be no doubt that if RBKC Building Control had done its job properly, the refurbishment works would not have been approved and construction of an unsafe cladding facade would have been prevented. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I turn to Arconic. The position of Arconic is dealt with in Celotex's written closing submission in detail. It is also covered by other call participants to substantially the same effect. I can therefore deal with this matter shortly. I wish to emphasize 2 points. First, unlike PIR, which could safely be used in compliance with the building regulations in a cladding system with an appropriate combination of other components, Rainabond PE panels could not be used safely in a cladding system at all. This was demonstrated by the BS 8414 tests carried out by the Department for Communities and Local Government following the Grenfell Tower fire. Those tests showed that cladding systems incorporating PE cord ACM panels failed to meet the BR135 criteria, irrespective of the kind of insulation with which the panels were combined. The tests failed even when non-combustible insulation was used in a cladding system with PE cord ACM panels. By contrast, a cladding system incorporating Celotex RS5000 with an ACM panel with a Class A2 filler met the test criteria. And as I've mentioned, the system tested by Celotex in April 2018, which replicated as closely as possible the system described in Celotex's product literature, also met the BR135 criteria. Arconic nevertheless suggests that Rainabond PE was capable of being used in a compliant manner in high-rise buildings. Celotex invites the inquiry to reject this contention. Contrary to Arconic's argument, Rainabond PE was incapable of being used on a building in such a way as to adequately resist the spread of fire over the external walls. Arconic knew that was the case. Its technical manager, Mr. Verler, repeatedly warned the company that ACM PE was dangerous and unsuitable for use on cladding facades. These warnings were unequivocal and not couched with qualifications and reservations. They demonstrate that Arconic's own technical manager regarded the product at the time as necessarily inappropriate and unusable. However, these warnings were overridden by the company, which was unwilling to stop selling Rainabond PE, despite knowing how dangerous it was. The second point I wish to emphasize is that Arconic's own documents and the evidence given by its managing director, Mr. Schmidt, make absolutely clear that Arconic deliberately misled the market about the true fire performance of Rainabond PE over an extended period of time. Rainabond PE was marketed in the UK and supplied for use at Grenfell Tower on the basis of a certificate from the BBA certifying that the product may be regarded as having a Class 0 surface. Arconic knew that this certification was invalid and false. Rainabond PE had never been tested under BS 476 Part 6 and 7, which are the tests necessary to achieve Class 0 classification. The product was only tested under the Euroclass regime, but those tests did not justify the Class 0 classification claimed by Arconic. So far as the cassette variant of Rainabond PE is concerned, Arconic knew that this variant only ever achieved the Class E classification when tested from 2004 onwards. That is one of the lowest classifications possible under the European testing regime. It meant that the product in cassette form could not be used on building facades. Those test results were never disclosed to the BBA or the market. The cassette variant, of course, is the version of the product that was used at Grenfell Tower. So far as the rivet variant of Rainabond PE is concerned, That initially achieved the Class B classification, but Arconic later acknowledged that those results were obtained by manipulating the test systems. From 2013 onwards, the Rivet variant only ever achieved Euroclass C. Under ADB2, a cladding panel classified as Class C could not be treated as having a Class 0 classification under British standards. That required at least Class B or better. In 2014, Arconic cancelled the Class B certifications that it had previously obtained for Reynabond PE. There was therefore no Class B classification in existence at the time that RB was sold for use at Grenfell Tower. The submission to the contrary made by Arconic this morning is in our submission wrong. Arconic did not disclose to the BBA that the Rivet variant only achieved a Class C classification after 2013, or that Arconic had cancelled the Class B classification previously obtained for the Rivet variant. That was despite the Class B classification of the Rivet variant having formed the basis of the BBA's certification of Reynabond PE as Class 0. Had Arconic disclosed the cassette test results or the post-2013 Rivet results to the BBA certificate would not have been issued in the terms it was, or would have been withdrawn. In either event, the BBA certificate could not have been relied upon by Arconic or other parties to support the use of Reynabond PE at Grenfell Tower. Arconic's documents also show that long before Reynabond PE was supplied to use at Grenfell Tower, Mr. Wöhler had repeatedly advised the company in strong terms that it should stop marketing Reynabond PE for use in architectural facades because the product was so dangerous. His advice, however, was overridden by Arconic's management on the grounds that it was technical and uncommercial. As a result, Reynabond PE continued to be promoted and marketed for use in cladding systems in the UK when there was no legitimate basis for doing so. The product should not have been sold or supplied for use at Grenfell Tower. Arconic should have stopped marketing it for use on building facades long before then. Arconic's suggestion that it should be exempted from criticism is, we submit, untenable. It is obvious that Arconic bears heavy responsibility for the specification and use of cladding panels at Grenfell Tower that it knew to be dangerous. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I reiterate Celotex's commitment to assisting this inquiry. As I said at the outset, Celotex has acknowledged with regret that there were shortcomings in the historic testing and certification of certain of its products. It has been transparent and candid about those shortcomings. It has learned lessons and made improvements to its business as a result. Celotex's role, however, needs to be seen in the context of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. Celotex submits that it is clear on the evidence that responsibility for the non-compliant cladding facade at Grenfell Tower lies, as I have outlined in this statement, with the construction professionals responsible for the design and construction of the facade or advising on it, and the TMO, RBKC, and Arconic. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement. Thank you for the opportunity to make this statement on behalf of Celotex.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Orr. That's very helpful and given us a lot to consider. At this point, we'll take the afternoon break and we'll resume at 3:30 when Mr. Webb, Queen's Counsel, will make a statement on behalf of Kingspan. So 3:30, please. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're now going to hear the closing statement on behalf of Kingspan from Mr. Geraint Webb, Queen's Counsel. Good afternoon, Mr. Webb. I can see you. Can you see me?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Yes.
Good. And we can obviously hear each other as well. That's good. Well, we're ready to hear your statement. Off you go then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Grenfell Tower fire was a tragedy that should never have happened. And as I said in the opening statement, Kingspan Insulation welcomes and supports the vitally important work of this inquiry in its efforts to determine what went wrong and why. In Module 1 of Phase 2, the inquiry has been considering, amongst other things, the numerous failings which resulted in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower being non-compliant with the building regulations. Kingspan Insulation had no direct involvement in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. It played no role in the design or installation of the cladding system. It provided no advice or technical guidance to those responsible for the design of the refurbishment or the installation. It had no contractual relationship with the council or the TMO or any of the designers or any of the contractors engaged on the refurbishment. It did not provide any products directly to those involved in the refurbishment. It was not informed that its K15 phenolic insulation product was being used on the tower, and it was not aware that K15 had been used on the tower until after the fire. Those responsible for the design of the refurbishment had specified that Celotex's PIR insulation would be installed behind the cladding, and almost all of the rain screen insulation purchased for the tower, approximately 95% of it, was Celotex's PIR. However, since the fire, it's become clear that a limited amount of K15 phenolic insulation was used as a substitute when supplies of the Celotex PIR could not be obtained for a short period. In total, only about 5% of the rain screen insulation purchased for use on Grenfell Tower was K15. Given that Kingspan Insulation had no involvement in any aspect of the design or refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, and no witnesses connected to the company were called to give evidence in Module 1, my submissions on Module 1 will be brief. Much of the evidence heard in Module 1 and 2 was focused on aspects of the rain screen cladding and the facade insulation used on Grenfell Tower, and so my submissions will also focus on these issues. However, it's important to keep in mind at all times that the tragedy was a result of multiple failings on the part of many different entities and individuals that went far beyond the issues relating to the cladding system. Such failings included, for example, failings in respect of the window systems, fire doors and their automatic closures, the gas supply cutoff, and the smoke extraction system, as well as in relation to the response to the fire on the night. The reasons for the tragedy cannot be properly understood unless the importance of those numerous wider issues are fully recognised. Focusing on the cladding system itself, the starting point is the building regulations. At the time of the refurbishment of the tower, the collective guidance in approved document B and technical guidance note 18 required any cladding system for the tower to be assessed under one of 4 available routes to compliance. As Kingspan Insulation noted in its closing submissions in Phase 1, none of these routes was satisfied in respect to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. Kingspan Insulation therefore agrees with the conclusion reached at paragraph 26.4 of the Phase 1 report, namely that the design of the refurbishment was not compliant with the building regulations. The system, therefore, should not have been specified or installed. Further, it should not have been approved by building control. When it comes to considering how and why a non-compliant cladding system was specified and installed, we would invite you to have regard to the following 4 points in particular. First and foremost, we invite you to consider the dominance of the role played by the PE cord ACM cladding in the Grenfell Tower fire. As set out at paragraph 2.13 of the Phase 1 report, the evidence has established that the principal reason why the flames spread so rapidly up, down and around the building was the presence of the PE cord cladding, which acted as a source of fuel. Put simply, the use of Arconic's Rainabond PE ACM cladding on Grenfell Tower rendered the tower unsafe following the refurbishment works. It's now clear that prior to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, Arconic knew that the cassette version of its PE cord ACM cladding only achieved Euroclass E when tested. It therefore knew, or should have known, that its claim of a Euroclass B classification was incorrect, certainly in respect to the cassette version that was subsequently used on Grenfell Tower. It knew or should have known that the product was unsafe and not suitable for use on tall residential buildings. As far as we are aware, no system incorporating PE cord ACM cladding of the type used on the tower has ever successfully passed a full-scale BS 8414 fire test in combination with any form of insulation. After the Grenfell Tower fire, the Department for Communities and Local Government commissioned 2 BS 8414 tests on PE cord ACM cladding systems. One system incorporated PIR insulation, the other incorporated synthetic mineral fiber insulation classified as non-combustible. Both systems failed the test in under 8 minutes and therefore failed to meet the criteria set by BR 135. The independent expert panel concluded that ACM with unmodified polyethylene filler presents a significant fire hazard on residential buildings at any height with any form of insulation. This is a vitally important issue. It is clear from all of the available evidence that whilst the building regulations did not permit PIR or phenolic facade insulation to be used with the Arconic PE cord ACM cladding, the Arconic cladding would have been unsafe whether it had been combined with combustible or non-combustible insulation, as demonstrated by that DCLG testing. Furthermore, the extensive independent and peer-reviewed testing and modelling carried out and published by Effectis has shown that there would have been no material difference in the nature and speed of the spread of the fire at Grenfell Tower had the PE cord ACM cladding been combined with non-combustible synthetic mineral fibre insulation instead of PIR. Full details of that testing and modelling are provided in footnote 11 of our written closing submissions. In addition, the validity of the expert panel's conclusion that PE cord ACM cladding presents a significant fire hazard with any form of insulation is also clear from the evidence relating to other serious fires involving this type of cladding. Such fires have occurred in buildings using synthetic mineral fibre insulation directly behind PE cord ACM, such as the Torre Amber fire in Madrid in August 2020 and the fire at the Torch in Dubai in 2015, or even when there was no facade installation at all, such as at the Address building in Dubai in 2015. The common factor, again and again, has been the PE cord ACM cladding. Full details of the fire in Milan just 2 weeks ago are not yet available, but the indications are that this was yet another fire involving PE cord ACM. The second major failing was in respect of design. Those at Studio E lacked experience of high-rise cladding systems. This was coupled with widespread ignorance of the risks inherent in PE cord ACM cladding amongst those involved in the project. Overall, there was a lack of understanding and appreciation in relation to the question of safety when it came to the design of the refurbishment, as demonstrated, for example, in respect to the positioning of cavity barriers and detailing around the window reveals. In this context, it's important to note that even if the Arconic cassette system had genuinely been Euroclass B, it would still have been impermissible to combine such cladding with PIR or phenolic insulation under the linear routes to compliance. Thus, the design of the cladding system on any view is not compliant with the regulations. The third major failing was in respect of building control. Building control should have acted as an external and independent safeguard on the refurbishment project to ensure that the specified cladding system was compliant with the building regulations. It failed in this critical role. The inquiry's appointing building control expert, Ms. Menzies, confirmed in her report that she'd not seen any evidence of communications between any party and building control that refers to the compliance or non-compliance of the cladding system, nor any evidence that building control requested details of the cladding system's ability to resist fire spread. She described this as a fundamental failing. Ultimately, those responsible for the design, construction, and approval of Grenfell Tower refurbishment bear responsibility for the fact that the refurbishment failed to comply with the building regulations and was unsafe. Fourthly, however, Kingspan Insulation is firmly of the view that the building regulations themselves were flawed and remain flawed to this day, because the linear route compliance permits systems to be built based on small-scale testing of individual components, without requiring the safety of the system as a whole to be proved in a full-scale fire test. Had a full-scale fire test been required in respect to the Grenfell Tower cladding system, then it's clear from the DCLG tests that it would have failed, whatever insulation was used. Mr. Chairman, I now turn to Module 2. My submissions on Module 2 fall into three parts. First, a few introductory points in respect of certain issues relevant to Module 2 evidence relating to Kingspan Insulation. Second, I shall consider the evidence concerning testing, certification, and classification of K15. And thirdly, I shall respond to some of the other allegations that have been advanced against Kingspan Insulation, which do not directly relate to the K15 itself. The first point I wish to address at the outset concerns the safety of K15 insulation. On numerous occasions during this inquiry, it has been asserted that K15 phenolic insulation is somehow unsafe for use in rain screen cladding. It's also been asserted that the company knew that it was unsafe. These allegations are demonstrably untrue. They're contrary to the evidence. In total, 14 different cladding systems incorporating current K15, the type of insulation used on the tower, have successfully passed full-scale BS 8414 fire tests. Each of those tests is listed at footnote 5 of our written closing submissions. Those tests have involved a range of different cladding systems, including ACM systems with an A2 rating. There have also been other successful tests of systems incorporating K15 conducted by third parties with which Kingspan Insulation has had no involvement. Kingspan Insulation is not aware of any other type of rain screen insulation that has passed so many different cladding systems. I'll repeat that. Kingspan Insulation is not aware of any other type of rain screen insulation that has been used in so many different cladding systems which have passed full-scale BS 8414 fire tests. The only realistic way to test the cladding system is via full-scale fire test of the whole system. This was the conclusion referred to by Dr. Lane in her presentation to the inquiry on day 68 in November last year, referencing Dr. Raymond Connolly's conclusions in his 1994 report, and it remains the position today. At the time of the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, approved document B expressly permitted cladding systems that had successfully passed a BS 8414 test to be used on high-rise residential buildings. Thus, such systems were recognised to be safe systems. The MHCLG guidance for building owners of multi-storey, multi-occupied residential buildings, dated January 2020, also explicitly allows the retention of correctly installed and maintained rain screen cladding systems which have passed a BS 8414 test. Kingspan Insulation relies on each of its 14 successful 8414 tests to demonstrate why it is confident and right to be confident that K15 can safely be used and retained in appropriate cladding systems. The second point concerns the role played by insulation in a rain screen cladding system. No one doubts that residential buildings should be insulated. No one doubts that rain screen cladding systems should contain insulation. Indeed, one of the primary objectives of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project was to improve the insulation and thermal performance of the building. But any rain screen insulation, including non-combustible insulation, will play some role in a cladding fire, not least because its insulating properties act to retain heat from combustion of the cladding system. Therefore, the relevant question insofar as insulation is concerned is not what would have happened if there had been no rain screen insulation at Grenfell Tower, but whether the nature or speed of the spread of the fire would have been materially different had an alternative type of insulation been used. On this issue, the scientific evidence is clear and unequivocal. The nature and speed of the spread of the fire would have been no different had non-combustible insulation been used instead of PIR or phenolic insulation behind the PE called ACM cladding. Testing commissioned by the DCLG following the Grenfell Tower demonstrated that the systems incorporating PE called ACM failed BS 8414 tests, whether combined with non-combustible synthetic mineral fibre or with PIR insulation. Both systems, as I've said, failed very quickly in under 8 minutes. In fact, the system incorporating non-combustible insulation failed marginally quicker than the system incorporating PIR. Independent testing and modelling by Effectis, as I've said, demonstrates that the PE called ACM was so dominant in the fire spread that there would have been no material difference in the rate of the fire spread on Grenfell Tower if non-combustible synthetic mineral fibre had been used instead of the PIR insulation. It's understood that the inquiry will be producing its own expert evidence on these fundamental issues in Module 7. The third point to emphasise is this. Whilst Kingspan Insulation has fully acknowledged and apologised for historical shortcomings in its processes and procedures as set out in its written statements, many other allegations and assertions have been made against the company and its employees, which are quite simply untrue. As I've said, allegations attacking K15's safety have been made, which totally ignore the relevant evidence, namely that K15 has been used in more cladding systems which have passed full-scale fire tests than any other type of installation as far as we're aware. And I shall deal with other similar allegations shortly. It is part of the role of counsel to the inquiry to put allegations to witnesses in order to elicit an answer in evidence. There is, though, an inherent risk that those observing the questioning process may mistakenly believe that an assertion put to a witness must be true, but it may not be. That risk is all the greater when the incorrect assertion is repeated time and time again, either by counsel or the media, as if it were an established fact. Core participants are therefore dependent on you, Mr. Chairman, and you, members of the panel, to be extremely careful when considering the totality of the evidence, both written and oral, to ensure that the process followed does not result in an incorrect understanding of the true factual position or incorrect conclusions being drawn. Kingspan Insulation has been criticised for certain shortcomings between 2005 and 2014. It has learned from its mistakes and has taken steps to ensure that its processes and procedures are improved. But such matters should not distract from the important goal of establishing the actual cause of the fire, the true reasons for its tragic consequences, and the need to ensure that necessary measures are taken to protect life safety in future. The reality is that none of the shortcomings on the part of Kingspan Insulation are relevant to the unsafe design of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, nor were they causative of the fire, and nor were they caused to the nature or speed of the spread of the fire. In respect to the testing of K15, to which I now turn, various allegations have been made to the effect that Kingspan Insulation somehow manipulated BS8414 tests. Such allegations are not true. None of the BS8414 tests of K15 have been manipulated. More generally, the criticisms made of Kingspan Insulation in respect of testing can be categorised into 6 main themes, and I shall deal with each of them in turn now. The first category of allegations concerns the design of the 2005 BS8414 test. That criticism is misplaced. The BS8414 test was introduced in 2002 and was a new type of test, being a test of a system rather than a particular product. The 2005 test was one of the very first BS8414 tests undertaken. At that time, it was reasonably believed by those involved that testing a single specific type of cladding would not be particularly helpful for fire engineering professionals. The thinking was that it would be better to test a build-up that could be taken to simulate the performance of a generic, non-combustible outer cladding. Contrary to the assertions advanced by others, there was nothing dishonest or inappropriate about Kingspan Insulation's approach to the 2005 test. It was a bona fide test of a system which had been suggested by the BRE. Both the BRE and Kingspan Insulation were trying to understand how a new testing regime was intended to be used by professionals within the industry. Furthermore, the rationale behind the approach adopted was entirely reasonable. Indeed, in 2014, the regulatory guidance was amended so as to allow evidence from a test on one system to be used by fire engineering experts to advise on the safety of a different system via desktop studies. Thus, the concept of extrapolation came to be accepted as a legitimate route to compliance. There have also been allegations made that the 2005 test was rigged in some way. Again, these allegations are simply untrue. It was a valid test conducted transparently and honestly. Criticisms have been made of the way in which the timings of the test were recorded, but those timings were recorded by BRE employees, and Kingspan Insulation was not involved in taking or recording those timings. In any event, the system met the BR135 criteria, regardless of any issues concerning the way in which the timings were recorded. This was made clear by the BRE in their evidence. There has also been an attempt to allege the 2005 test used unrepresentative fire barriers. The basis of this allegation has never been understood and has not been supported by any expert evidence. Kingspan Insulation understands that fire barriers used were off-the-shelf purchases that were on the market at the time and typical of such products. The allegations that the 2005 test was somehow rigged by Kingspan Insulation is one of numerous examples of very serious allegations which have been made against the company, which have no basis in fact. The 2005 test was conducted honestly and transparently by Kingspan Insulation and the BRE, and that is what the evidence shows. The fact that repeated allegations have been made to the contrary does not change that reality. Erroneous allegations have also been made about the requirement for a BR135 classification report. It was repeatedly put to witnesses in the context of the 2005 test that a classification report was somehow necessary in order to enable the company to state that the test had met the criteria set by BR135. The true position is that at the time of the 2005 test, there was no regulatory requirement to obtain a classification report. There was always an option available, but the relevant data was set out in the test report provided by the test house, and competent professionals could satisfy themselves as to whether the data met BR135 criteria. 10 years after the test, however, there was a change in the guidance. In June 2015, BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 for the first time suggested a classification report should be obtained. Within 3 months of this new guidance being published, Kingspan Insulation sought a classification report for the 2005 test. All the relevant information relating to the 2005 test was set out in the original test report, and so there was no difficulty in BRE issuing a classification report in 2015 for the 2005 test. This has also been confirmed by the BRE in their submissions and evidence. Furthermore, those competent to do so can look at the 2005 test and ascertain for themselves that the test met the BR135 criteria. Finally, in relation to the 2005 test, it was alleged during oral submissions yesterday that the only successful BS8414 test on K15 at the time of supply to Grenfell was the 2005 test. This is incorrect. In fact, when K15 was first purchased for Grenfell Tower in May 2015, a further successful BS8414 test of K15 had taken place. And when K15 was supplied for the second time in September 2015, a further 2 successful BS8414 tests of K15 had taken place. All 3 of these tests were in respect to the current K15, the type used on the tower. The second category of criticism concerns the fact that Kingspan Insulation continued to rely upon the 2005 test after certain changes were made in respect to the way in which K15 was manufactured. The company has fully accepted that the change in technology means that it should have reconducted the 2005 test with K15 manufactured using the new technology. However, its failure to do so was based on its honest belief that the change in technology would not make any material difference to the fire performance of the product in a BS8414 test. Dr. Malcolm Rochford, the technical director at the relevant time, explained, based on his extensive experience of phenolics at ICI and at Kingspan Insulation, that both new technology and old technology K15 use fundamentally the same type of phenolic foam, and that there was no reason on a chemical level to expect any significant differences in terms of the fire performance between the 2 technologies. He explained that if anything, the new technology benefited from a less flammable blowing agent. On 6th of June 2019, Kingspan Insulation undertook a BS8414 test of a system which was as close as possible to the system used in the 2005 test, but which incorporated current K15 instead of old technology K15. The system passed the test. This 2019 replacement test demonstrates that the failure to undertake a replacement for the 2005 test earlier in time has not given rise to any fire safety risks. Any fire engineer or other expert who relied upon that original 2005 test now has the replacement test to rely upon in respect to the current K15. The company has now put in place a rigorous audit and change management system to ensure continuing product compliance. The third category of allegations relating to testing concerns fire performance. It has wrongly been asserted on numerous occasions that new technology K15 has a worse fire performance than old technology K15. There's absolutely no scientific or expert evidence to support such an assertion. The allegation has been based in particular on a report by Ivor Meredith of a December 2007 BS8414 test of a cladding system incorporating aluminium cassettes. That system failed. It was asserted by counsel in cross-examination that the new technology K15 failed spectacularly in this December 2007 test, and that the test proved that the new technology K15 had a worse performance than old technology K15. Such assertions are patently incorrect. K15 did not fail the test in 2007, let alone fail it spectacularly as asserted. The failure of the system tested in December 2007 demonstrates that that cladding system as a whole was not capable of passing the demanding requirements of the BS 8414 test. The failure of the test says nothing about new technology K15 as against old technology K15. This reality is demonstrated by the fact that the December 2000 test was repeated in January 2008 using non-combustible synthetic mineral fiber insulation instead of K15, and it failed again. Yet no one considers that the failure of the 2008 test means that the synthetic mineral fiber insulation is unsafe or is somehow less safe than old technology K15. It would be perverse and wholly wrong for the inquiry to conclude that the difference between the 2005 8414 test result and the 2007 test result could somehow be attributed to the slight technological changes in respect of K15, as opposed to the gross differences in the designs of the cladding systems being tested. Yet that was the assertion repeatedly put to witnesses as if it were true, and then reported as if it were established fact in the media. It's also notable that Mr. Meredith, whose report described the failure of that December 2000 test, was not present when the test took place. Yet his description of the test as a raging inferno was referenced on numerous occasions during this inquiry as if it was a first-hand witness account. It was not. He did not witness the test, nor is there any evidence that he saw even a video recording the test before writing his report. In contrast, Mr. Baker, a BRE certification scheme manager who did attend the test and witnessed it, described the language used in Mr. Meredith's report as quite flowery, and he himself declined to call the failure spectacular when invited to do so by counsel to the inquiry. Nor is it clear why almost no mention has been made during cross-examination of the fact that the same rain screen cladding system failed when tested in January 2008 using non-combustible insulation, despite evidence relating to this test having been drawn to the inquiry's attention. The fire performance of new technology K15 cannot be assessed on the basis of a comment made by one person in respect of one test of a whole cladding system which he did not witness and when he had limited experience of such tests. Conversely, the ability of current K15 to be used successfully in different cladding systems is demonstrated by the fact that at least 14 cladding systems using current K15 have passed BS 8414 tests, as I've said. The repeated assertions that new technology K15 has an inferior fire performance to old technology K15 are entirely unsupported by any scientific evidence. The panel was enjoined to consider the basis of each and every allegation levelled against Kingspan Insulation. Time and time again, there is no scientific basis to support the allegations advanced. The fourth area of criticism concerns two BS 8414 tests conducted in 2014. The first was a Trespa cladding system, the second was of a terracotta tile cladding system. Both tests were undertaken using non-standard K15, which differed from current K15, and it used a thicker unperforated facer. It was made using a different blowing agent. The first Trespa system failed the BS 8414 test, and the second terracotta system passed. Whilst these R&D changes, intended to improve thermal performance, were considered by employees at the time to be irrelevant to the issue of fire performance in a full-scale BS 8414 test, Kingspan Insulation has accepted that it should have made clear that those 2014 tests used non-standard K15. The important point, however, is that new tests were carried out very shortly afterwards using current K15. BS 8414 tests of systems featuring a terracotta tile rain screen were undertaken in April 2015 and again in January 2016 using current K15. Those systems also passed. Accordingly, if any fire engineer relied upon the successful 2014 terracotta test, which used the R&D version of K15, then they would similarly be able to have relied upon the 2015 and 2016 tests as relevant alternative tests using current K15. Out of an abundance of caution, Kingspan Insulation also carried out a replacement test of the unsuccessful 2014 TRESPA test using current K15 in 2019. And the test again achieved the same result, i.e. just as it failed in 2014, so it failed again in 2019. Thus, again, if any fire engineer did have any regard to the failed 2014 test, they can now refer to the replacement test. In summary, therefore, whilst these two 2014 test results should have been marked as R&D results, there was no intention to mislead anyone, and the further testing demonstrates that if any fire engineer did place reliance upon either of those tests, then any such reliance would not have given rise to any fire safety issues. Any such engineer can now rely on the further testing as alternatives. Kingspan has put in place improved procedures so as to ensure that the R&D testing is not relied upon for current marketing products. The fifth area of criticism concerns the withdrawal of the test reports I've been discussing. Kingspan Insulation removed the test and classification reports for the 2005 test and the successful 2014 terracotta test from its website and all marketing literature in March 2019, so as to ensure that they were not relied upon in any new projects. The company also then wrote to fire engineers, including the BRE, on the 23rd of October 2020, confirming that the test reports for the 2005 test and those two 2014 tests were being withdrawn, but explaining that the replacement tests could be relied upon instead of the withdrawn reports. The company's withdrawal of these three tests was an appropriate and prudent step. It acted reasonably and responsibly, ensuring that it had conducted appropriate testing to enable all those within the industry to understand precisely why the company was confident that the withdrawal of the three tests gave rise to no risks to health or safety. The test reports, the replacement tests, are available to anyone who wishes to rely upon them in place of any of the three original tests. Finally, in relation to testing, it has been suggested to various witnesses that Kingspan Insulation should not have claimed Class 0 in respect of K15. This criticism is not accepted. Whilst there may be room for more than one interpretation of the relevant regulations and guidance in respect to the requirements for claiming Class 0, Kingspan Insulation considers that its interpretation is reasonable, valid, and legitimate, having regard to the relevant statutory guidance set out in approved document B. K15's original Class 0 classification was derived from the testing for phenolic products produced by its Dutch sister company in Kesteren. The BBA accepted these test reports as appropriate evidence of K15's Class 0 classification, as explained in its evidence of the BBA. In May 2007, Kingspan Insulation tested the foil facer used on K15 to BS 476 Part 6 and 7. It passed the test. Approved document B requires either the product or surface material of a composite product to meet the relevant criteria set out in BS 476. K15 is a composite product for which the facer is the surface material, and following this valid testing, Kingspan Insulation rightly claimed that K15 was Class 0. It has been suggested to witnesses by counsel to the inquiry that the company should not have relied upon the wording of approved document B in respect of Class 0. This line of questioning was not supported by any expert evidence. Indeed, it appears to be directly contrary to the explanation provided by Dr. Lane, who explained that in 1985, the definition of Class 0 was significantly changed, in part because the requirement to consider the substrate with the surface was removed from the text in the statutory guidance document. This remained the definition to the time of the Grenfell Tower fire. Thus, Kingspan Insulation's interpretations of the requirement of BS 476 Part 6 and 7 is consistent with Dr. Lane's evidence. There's a deliberate change to the statutory guidance to permit the testing of the surface material of a composite product, as opposed to the testing of the entirety of the product. The guidance expressly permitted the testing of the foil facer of K15, and that is what was tested. Furthermore, this understanding of the guidance has also to be considered in the context of Mr. Pargeter's evidence that when you test a composite product like K15, the facer can delaminate from the product and then touch the burner element, which affects the test. Kingspan Insulation cannot be criticised for testing K15 in accordance with the plain reading of the text of the statutory guidance following an express amendment to permit testing in this manner. The repeated assertions to the contrary are not only unfounded, but appear to ignore the expert evidence which the inquiry itself has adduced on this point. Certification. I now turn to issues which have been raised concerning the BBA and LABC certification of K15. The BBA is responsible for the contents of its own certificates. The BBA is qualified to make judgments about the content of the certificates and/or seek expert assistance if needed, and it can and does amend the wording of its certificates. The BBA also regularly audits Kingspan Insulation's manufacturing processes. The first BBA certificate relating to K15 was issued in October 2008. 5 further versions were published between this date and November 2020. As regards the content of K15's BBA certificates, John Alban of the BBA confirmed in his evidence that the certificate content has evolved over time, which is the case with most BBA certificates, to reflect external changes and updates to the standard BBA wording for a particular product type. I believe that the wording has been clarified since the issue of the certificate, but I have no concerns as to the content of previous issues if it is to be read by a suitably experienced and competent individual behaving ethically. 4 of Kingspan Insulation's witnesses were asked questions about a reference to paragraph 12.7 of approved document B in the K15 BBA certificate dated April 2010. In the course of that questioning, it was repeatedly suggested that the certificate was incorrect to reference paragraph 12.7. In each case, the witness's attention was drawn only to the first part of paragraph 12.7, which requires any insulation used in the external wall construction of a building over 18 meters to be of limited combustibility. However, during questioning, none of those 4 witnesses was taken to the second part of paragraph 12.7, which makes it clear that the restriction does not apply to certain masonry cavity wall constructions. The effect of this exemption was to permit the use of K15 in such masonry cavity wall constructions. The second sentence explains why paragraph 12.7 of approved document B was referred to in the BBA certificate. Further, Mr. Alban of the BBA explained precisely this point in his witness statement and explained that certificate wording was technically correct and that a suitably competent reader would have no difficulty in understanding the meaning. It's therefore not understood why Kingspan Insulation witnesses were not taken to the second part of paragraph 12.7 when being asked to justify why that paragraph was referred to in the BBA certificate, particularly given that the certificate was drafted by the BBA and the BBA had explained why it was drafted that way. Kingspan Insulation cannot be criticised for the BBA's decision to refer to that paragraph in its certificate. The LABC also produced some certificates in respect of K15. The LABC was responsible for drafting those certificates with the assistance of Herefordshire Building Control. Wording was only included on the LAB certificate, which had been authorised by the LABC. As the inquiries heard, the 2009 LAB certificate stated that K15 can be considered as a material of limited combustibility. In its written opening submissions, Kingspan Insulation accepted and acknowledged that, taken in isolation, this sentence could be misleading. The LABC has tried to suggest in its submissions that Kingspan Insulation is somehow to blame for the use of this language, even though it is wording that came from Mr. Jones of Herefordshire Building Control and was not suggested or provided by Kingspan Insulation. Kingspan Insulation is not to blame for LABC's choice of wording. LABC has to take responsibility for its own choice of language in its own certificates. Whatever the reason for LABC's choice of wording in 2009, the relevant language was not included in the subsequent certificates. Accordingly, at the time of supply of K15 for use on Grenfell Tower, the applicable LABC certificate of the 30th of March 2015 did not contain the wording which has been criticised, and nor had the prior certificate of 2013. The relevant point, therefore, is this: whatever criticisms might be made about the LABC's choice of language in its 2009 certificate, there's absolutely no evidence that anyone involved in the design of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment read that outdated 2009 certificate, far less that they relied upon it or were misled by it in any way. In addition, there has been some criticism about some of the product literature relating to K15. Kingspan Insulation accepted before the start of Module 2 that certain statements made in early versions of K15 product literature and other information issued prior to 2014 could and should have made it clearer that the 2005 BS8414 test related to a particular system and advised caution against applying the 2005 test too broadly. However, this has to be seen in the context of the newness of the BS8414 test and general uncertainty within the industry at the time as to the extent to which it was appropriate to extrapolate the performance of one cladding system in a BS 8414 test to other systems. Ultimately, the position was clarified in June 2014, Technical Guidance Note 18, which made it clear that a BS 8414 test in respect of one system could be relied upon by appropriate professionals when assessing the likely performance of other systems. In any event, at the time of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, Kingspan Insulation standard advice to clients correctly referred to approved document B and to Technical Guidance Note 18 and appropriately summarised relevant routes to compliance. Again, whatever criticisms have been made of the historical product information, there is therefore absolutely no evidence that anyone involved in the design of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was misled in any material way by any of the outdated product information relating to K15. I now turn to allegations about Kingspan Insulation itself. One of the most perplexing allegations that has been advanced is the assertion that the company's actions were somehow causative of the tragedy that occurred because K15, and I quote, set the precedent that combustible insulation could genuinely pass a BS 8414 test and so be used over 18 metres. But such an allegation makes no sense whatsoever. As I've explained, current K15, the type used on the tower, has been used in 14 different systems, which have each genuinely passed full-scale BS 8414 tests. Those have all been proper tests in respect to which no wrongdoing has taken place. The fact that numerous systems incorporating K15 have validly passed BS 8414 tests cannot render Kingspan Insulation responsible for any wrongdoing on the part of any other manufacturer. The allegation is a nonsense in fact and in law. The second point on this topic is that Kingspan Insulation's corporate culture has also come under attack. The reality is that Kingspan Insulation's priority has always been about the safety of its products. It has never pursued commercial interests at the risk of life or fire safety. Kingspan Insulation has provided a very considerable volume of documents to the inquiry, spanning a period of over 2 decades. Of those disclosed, over 23,500 have been provided by the inquiry to core participants. That is 3 times greater than the volume of documents, 7,703, provided from Celotex, notwithstanding that K15 amounted to only 5% of the rain screen insulation purchased for the tower, while Celotex's PIR amounted to 95%. It's 63 times greater than the 378 documents provided in respect of Arconic's disclosure, notwithstanding that Arconic's PE cord ACM material covered the whole tower and was the principal cause for the spread of the fire. In short, virtually every aspect of Kingspan Insulation's business over the last 2 decades has been examined in detail for disclosure purposes. That process has unearthed a handful of emails and chats, mainly involving 3 individual former employers, which have revealed conduct that was totally inappropriate and unacceptable, and which has been acknowledged as such, and for which Kingspan Insulation has apologised unreservedly. Such improper behaviour has no place in Kingspan Insulation or the wider Kingspan Group, and is in no way reflective of its core values. None of those 3 employees remain in employment of the company. Those isolated communications are the exception, and they should not condemn the behaviour of the many hundreds of employees that work at Kingspan Insulation, let alone the 18,000 employees who work for Kingspan Group worldwide. The company has responded by taking robust measures, ensuring that its culture is embedded throughout the organisation, and details the numerous steps taken by the company as set out in its opening submissions. I now turn to the final point in relation to allegations that Kingspan Insulation misled the Housing, Communities and Local Government Parliamentary Select Committee in 2018. At that time, the linear route to compliance under the building regulations permitted rain screen cladding systems to be installed on buildings above 18 metres, provided all the material used had achieved certain classifications in small-scale fire tests. Kingspan Insulation considers that this approach is flawed and not based on scientific or empirical evidence. In particular, this approach takes no account of how individual products will perform when combined in a cladding system. As part of his evidence, Mr. Burnley, the then Managing Director of Kingspan Insulation, drew those concerns to the attention of the Select Committee and referred to some examples of BS 8414 tests of whole systems which had failed despite the fact that the individual components had achieved the necessary classifications. At the committee's request, the company provided details of 3 tests of the systems comprising Euroclass A1 and A2 cladding and insulation that had failed full-scale fire tests. One of those 3 tests was of a cladding system that Kingspan Insulation had arranged to be tested. The other 2 had been independently commissioned by third parties and had nothing to do with the company. When Mr. Parchester came to give evidence on the 9th of December 2020, he was subjected without any notice to extensive cross-examination to the effect that Kingspan Insulation had deliberately misled the Select Committee. Leaving aside for now whether such cross-examination is permissible under Article 9 of the Bill of Rights, which is a matter for you, Mr. Chairman, and to which we have drawn the inquiry's attention, the allegation that Kingspan Insulation misled Parliament is wholly wrong. The company was initially criticised for not informing the Select Committee that one of the test reports it had provided related to a cladding system which had contained deliberate design flaws. But that allegation was based on a misunderstanding of the true factual position. The report provided to the committee was of a system which was robustly built and contained no deliberate design flaws whatsoever. When that mistaken understanding was corrected, the company was then criticised for not providing the Select Committee with details of another system which had passed a BS 8414 test. That criticism is also entirely misplaced. The point being made to the Select Committee was that some systems which comply with the linear route will nevertheless be incapable of passing a BS 8414 test and are therefore unsafe. It was never being suggested that all systems passing the linear route would fail a fire test. The company provided details of the test which illustrated the relevant point of public safety which was being made. The other system which passed the test was irrelevant to the issue of public safety under consideration and so was not provided. Kingspan Insulation was acting in good faith by attending the Select Committee as requested and properly drawing attention to the 3 valid fire safety tests which demonstrate that the linear route to compliance is not 100% effective in screening out unsafe cladding systems. The company drew the Parliamentary Select Committee's attention to a genuine and important issue of public safety. It should not have been criticised for doing so during the course of this inquiry. The criticism is particularly difficult to understand in circumstances in which the inquiry's own expert, Dr. Lane, has presented evidence as to the importance of full-scale testing and the problems associated with small-scale testing, as I've mentioned. The issue of public safety raised by Kingspan Insulation is real. The system based upon the classification of individual products in small-scale fire tests is not fail-safe. For example, if Studio E had switched the specification for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment to non-combustible synthetic mineral fibre insulation instead of PIR, the proposed system would have been superficially compliant with the linear route because of Arconic's PE cord ACM wrongful classification of Euroclass B. However, the evidence clearly indicates that the tragic outcome of the Grenfell Tower fire would have been the same even if non-combustible mineral fibre insulation had been used with the PE cord ACM instead of PIR. Conversely, full-scale fire testing of the Grenfell Tower cladding system would have revealed the lack of safety of the proposed system. Kingspan Insulation strongly believes that it should be a requirement of the building regulations that every cladding system proposed for use on a residential building with a floor above 18 metres should have to pass BS 8414 test, regardless of the classification of the individual components. This is the best and most robust way to ensure that all cladding systems are safe. Kingspan Insulation will continue to state its position on this important issue of public safety, even if others try to criticise it for doing so. Finally, Mr. Chairman, and by way of conclusion, Kingspan Insulation emphasises the following points. First, extensive testing shows that at least 14 different systems incorporating K15 have passed full-scale fire tests under BS 8414. Those systems are safe systems. Second, Kingspan Insulation recognises that there were certain shortcomings in respect of some aspects of the testing of K15, but those shortcomings have not resulted in anyone being misled in any material way. The replacement tests carried out means that any professional who relied upon any relevant historical testing can now rely on replacement tests in any event. Third, whilst criticisms have been made of the wording in early versions of K15 certificates issued by the LABC, the relevant issues had been corrected long before the refurbishment. The certificates current at the time of the refurbishment were appropriately worded. Furthermore, there is no evidence that any person involved in the refurbishment relied on, let alone was misled by, the wording of any LABC certificates for K15. Finally, it's imperative that the inquiry move on from the unfounded accusations that have been made and apply a clear, calm, and measured approach to the evidence. That evidence is unequivocal. The type of Arconic PE cord ACM cladding used on Grenfell Tower had only achieved a Euroclass E classification in testing and was unsafe for use with any type of insulation. Furthermore, the nature and speed of the spread of the fire would not have been materially different if non-combustible mineral fibre insulation had been used behind the ACM cladding instead of the type of insulation that was in fact used. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webb. We're due to hear next from Miss Leek, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Building Research Establishment, but I think we ought to have a short break before we do, and I'll apologise to Miss Leek when I eventually see her. So we'll come back to 4:30. I think that'll be enough. Thank you very much. 4:30, please. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're now going to hear a closing statement on behalf of the Building Research Establishment from Miss Leake, Queen's Counsel. Good afternoon, Miss Leake. Can you see me and hear me all right?
Good afternoon, sir. I can, thank you.
Right. Well, the first thing I must do is to apologise for keeping you hanging around for 15 minutes. The reason is that the previous speaker, I'm afraid, overran, and then we had to have a short break for inquiry purposes. So I'm sorry about that, and you should not feel that you're under pressure to take any less than the time you've been allotted, which I think is
Thank you, sir.
which I think is half an hour, if you need the whole half hour, of course.
Sir, I don't think I will take up the whole half hour in any event.
All right. Well, off you go when you're ready.
So thank you. First of all, BRE would like to recognise publicly the courage and determination of all of the bereaved survivors and residents, knowing that for many, the inquiry process will have been a painful and distressing experience. On behalf of BRE, I would like to offer our heartfelt condolences to all those who have been affected by the fire and its aftermath. Over the last year, BRE and its legal team have attended many days of the inquiry's hearings remotely and observed counsel to the inquiry's examination of the conduct of a number of organisations and individuals dating back several years. This is the first time that there has been such comprehensive and intense scrutiny of the conduct and oversight of the building industry in this country. The evidence has shown that it is much needed. As an organisation which has worked to improve the built environment and ensure the health and safety of those who use it, BRE welcomes this scrutiny and throughout has cooperated fully with the inquiry. In looking at the events, the inquiry has shone a light on practices, policies and procedures and regulation that have fallen short of what is to be expected in this country, irrespective of whether they caused or contributed to the fire. I would like to reiterate on BRE's behalf its intention to remain open and not defensive, to acknowledge and learn from historic shortcomings identified, and to take on board any recommendations that the panel makes. BRE submitted in writing that nothing that it did or failed to do caused or contributed to the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower. Whilst BRE stands by that, we do not propose to set out the causative factors here. Rather, BRE wishes to use its allotted time for the following. First, to assist the inquiry in establishing facts insofar as they concern BRE. Second, to identify where there were shortcomings in BRE's own practices, processes, and procedures, irrespective of causation. Third, to reflect upon those. And fourth, to consider what questions might be asked in Module 6 to inform recommendations for the future of the regulatory regime. Turning now to those topics. First of all, establishing the facts. It was established in Module 1 that Kingspan's K15 and Celotex's RS5000 flammable insulation boards came to be used with Arconic's Rainabond panels in cladding systems that were installed onto Grenfell Tower. The fitting of those composite systems proved to be fatal. The inquiry has heard much from core participants about events that preceded that installation on a broad range of topics, with some being more central to others to the inquiry's mandate. BRE emphasises again, BRE did not test or classify the composite systems that were installed onto Grenfell Tower. No manufacturer engaged a testing house to do that task. However, during the course of the evidence, the following matters that did involve BRE were scrutinised by the inquiry. BRE tested to BS 8414, Part 1, a system that incorporated K15 on 31st of May 2005. BRE produced a BR135 classification report for that specific system in 2015. BRE tested to BS 8414 Part 2, a system that incorporated RS5000 on the 2nd of May 2014, and it produced a BR135 classification report that inaccurately listed the components in that system. So these tests at BRE were of different systems from those fitted on the tower, and the relevant BRE test reports and classification reports do not relate to or classify any systems other than the systems tested on those dates, nor do they relate to or classify any individual component parts. Anyone saying or believing otherwise was wrong. With regard to Kingspan's test of May 2005, BRE explained in its oral opening statement for Module 2 that it was not inappropriate for a classification report to be produced 10 years later in 2015. BRE's Tony Baker explained why in his evidence. A test report is a statement of fact relating to the system tested at that time, from which a classification report may be produced if the system tested met the criteria of BR 135. Both the test report and classification report relate only to the system tested. It is now known that the formula of K15 was changed without BRE's knowledge after the May 2005 test. Kingspan changing the formula of K15 in the intervening period rendered the classification report of no use to Kingspan, the market, or building control. There is no obligation on a test laboratory to interrogate the test sponsor as to whether the composition of any components has changed between the test and the issuing of a classification report. And there was no error at BRE in issuing that classification report, which stated that it was valid only for the system as installed and as detailed in the corresponding test report. With regard to Celotex's test of May 2014, it is also a fact that the cladding system described in Celotex's classification report would, if it had been subject to the test, have been capable of achieving BR 135 classification. This was established when the system as described in that classification report was tested to BS 8414 Part 2 following the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2018. Whether, how, and to what effect Kingspan and Celotex misused their test and classification reports is a question for the inquiry to answer. BRE is deeply troubled by the evidence about how those reports were used by Kingspan and Celotex. Irrespective of causation, BRE understands why Celotex's May 2014 test at BRE was subject to particular scrutiny. Former employees of Celotex have told this inquiry that they intentionally committed a fraud on the market by misdescribing a cladding system for which Celotex was the test sponsor. Celotex failed to declare that the system tested by BRE on the 2nd of May 2014 included a 6mm magnesium oxide board and that two different thicknesses of Marley Eternit board were used, 8mm as well as 12mm. In relation to allegations that were made by Celotex's former employees, Jonathan Roper and Jamie Hayes, about BRE's former employee, Phil Clark, BRE would like to refer you to the relevant paragraphs of its written closing submissions for Module 2 at paragraphs 44 and 45. So in addition to what is set out in those paragraphs, we submit that it is inherently improbable that Mr. Clark, or indeed anyone at BRE, an independent testing house committed to making a positive difference in the built environment, would assist a company to deceive the market. There simply was no incentive or motive for Mr. Clark to join in that deception. This is supported evidentially by the fact that Mr. Clark declined Jonathan Roper's request to remove a photograph from the test report that showed the magnesium oxide board. If he had been a party to the deception, surely he would have removed the photograph. However, whether the conduct of Mr. Clark and other BRE staff lacked rigor and attention to detail during Celotex's test is another matter, and BRE has taken steps to improve its processes and procedures since that time. In that regard, I move on to the second and third topics, BRE's own practices and reflecting on shortcomings identified. BRE accepts, and readily so, that the inquiry's scrutiny of the Kingspan and Celotex tests, while they did not relate to the cladding systems that were installed onto Grenfell Tower, has identified that there was room for improvement in BRE's own processes and procedures. BRE recognises that its processes in 2014 were insufficiently robust to identify Celotex's dishonesty. It is accepted that there were genuine shortcomings in BRE's testing of Celotex's system on the 2nd of May 2014. The way in which that test was conducted did not meet the high standards that BRE expected of itself. Amongst other things, the magnesium oxide board should have been spotted and should have been recorded in the test report. BRE wishes the bereaved survivors and residents to know that it has reflected carefully on the issues highlighted by this inquiry and has made changes to its own internal processes, practices, and structures. Foremost among the changes that have been made to date are the following. BRE has been under new management since 2019. The new management has been working to ensure that the quality of BRE's processes, procedures, and systems matches BRE's scientific capabilities. There have been extensive changes to BRE's executive team, including a new executive responsible for oversight of the UCAS accredited services. Additional roles have been created to strengthen internal audit and the oversight of testing, classification, and certification. BRE will take on board the inquiry's recommendations, but emphasises that it is not waiting until the inquiry's report is published to make major changes and improvements. It is addressing the issues identified by this inquiry now. BRE's new leadership has implemented a major programme of improvement. This includes strengthening the role of BRE's Independent Impartiality Committee, which provides scrutiny of BRE's activities to ensure that it is acting impartially across all business areas. Implementation of an updated operational risk management framework and creation of a new system of audit. These address risks which go wider than those around quality and compliance and are supported by more extensive risk registers and more robust internal audit plans and systems for managing resulting actions. There have also been improvements to testing, including enhanced checking of test rigs, greater focus on photographic records throughout the test rig build process, increased checking of the documentation and materials for any products coming into the business, and improvements to test result data sheets. BRE has also implemented improvements to procedures in the updated BS 8414-2020 and a new system for the calibration of equipment. These changes have been applied within the current regulatory regime. The final issue I want to address concerns the future for the building industry. Unsafe cladding systems never should have been installed on Grenfell Tower. The bereaved survivors and residents and the wider public, in addition to learning in Module 2 how those unsafe systems came to be installed, must be assured after Module 6 that the governance of the building industry will be reformed to avoid a repetition of the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. The RE looks forward to contributing to Module 6. The RE is committed to assisting in the formulation of changes to the regime in the light of the flaws that have been identified to date. In the meantime, the RE suggests that the following questions should be explored as part of the inquiry's consideration of issues in Module 6. Whether the current regulatory regime, underpinned by manufacturers' self-declaration, remains fit for purpose, given what has been discovered during this inquiry about manufacturers' practices. Whether there should be a specific mechanism for reporting suspected dishonesty or misleading information in the market for use by testing houses like BRE and other stakeholders in the building industry. BRE has made clear, contrary to the suggestion of other core participants, that it is not a regulator. there is a question of how regulatory oversight can be improved and how testing houses like BRE can play a part in the regulatory environment. So in conclusion, BRE hopes that the process of examining the facts, practices, policies, and regulation in this forensic environment will contribute to the public understanding of what has happened in the past in the building industry and will contribute to the bereaved survivors and residents' understanding of what happened to them and their loved ones and why. As an organisation, BRE is committed to learning whatever lessons for the future can be drawn from that history. BRE will welcome the inquiry's report and recommendations in this investigation. They will be analysed carefully, and the lessons learned will be shared within the organisation and beyond to ensure continued organisational development and improvement in this critically important area of building practice. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Leake. You've been very economical with your time. I'm sorry that we kept you waiting quite so long in order to make your statement, but it's been
Not at all.
It's been very helpful, and you've raised some important questions for us to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
And at that point, we will conclude for the day. Tomorrow we shall hear some more closing statements from other core participants, and we'll do that at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow.